Welcome to Expand Your Mind. Since this is our first official lecture, we will be going over a range of topics fairly quickly to acclimate you to the types of things we will be discussing here on the channel, so brace yourself. This may seem like a lot at first, but we will be going in depth on these topics later, and you will see how everything really is connected. Firstly, a few things I think are true but cannot prove. God, or gods, do exist, but so do extraterrestrials, and they may well be the same thing. The history of humankind goes back way further than mainstream historians and even most archaeologists admit, and there is an energy of some sort that connects everything. Yes, everything. And while this force is more apparently strong in living things, it is not absent from things like stone and metal. Now a few things I know to be false. The Earth is not flat. It's just not. This is factually proven. I also don't believe it's hollow, but I don't rule out large interior cavities as a possibility. Human beings have been on Earth a lot longer than they say, as evidenced by dozens, if not hundreds, of out-of-place artifacts over the years, and our naive assumption that we are the pinnacle of human advancement is exactly the type of thinking that we wish to avoid here at Expand Your Mind. Finally, before we get into breaking down these previous statements, I have one utterly undeniable, irrevocable truth. People in power will do whatever it takes to maintain and or increase that power. This is true through all of history, and includes but is not limited to such acts as enslaving whole nations of people, lying to the masses, rewriting history to make themselves look better, slaughtering whole nations of people, assimilating or destroying opposing religions, and keeping advanced knowledge to themselves. These things have happened and are happening now in every government ever. There is no exception. Take, for example, the current situation in the Middle East. The United States is having difficulties with Iran, or vice versa, and who is to blame and who is in the right is a rather murky and gray area. There is no good guy or bad guy when it comes to war. There is only your side and their side. Therefore, if both of you are right, neither of you are right, and you are both wrong. We spend far too much time dividing ourselves along lines drawn on a map hundreds of years ago, and not enough time trying to connect with each other, learn from each other, and advance humanity as a whole. There are so many issues that come to light these days, and not just corruption of government, but corruption of the heart. People have become selfish, self-motivated, but hey, that's the American dream, to get your slice of the pie. What if I told you there was a better way? What if I told you, by simply placing yourself in the other person's shoes, you can get a whole new perspective on life, and possibly learn a thing or two? Instead, we're more content to fight amongst ourselves, too busy to make any effectual, real change in the world, because we're arguing over which political party is right. Doesn't make sense to me that you can be on one side of a party or the other, but you're still on one side of the line or the other. No two people agree on everything. Shouldn't we find a way to figure this out? Makes me angry to think that things like this are usually only two-sided, when in my eyes there are three sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. And it is on that middle ground that we must meet in order to move forward as a people. As the human race, we are obligated to each other. We owe it to each other. Everybody, no matter who they are, has faced some hardship in their life. Everybody has known pain and loss. Even the richest have felt a loved one pass away and known the loneliness that comes when someone you care for dies. How can we then look at each other and deny the humanity of one another? They have to raise inflation. They have to make you work harder for the same thing that you would have had to work less hard for a year ago. You have to break your back in order to turn the wheels of the machine to keep these countries going so they can continue to be at each other's throats. I don't think there is a population of people anywhere in the world who thinks war should even be a thing. We look at each other, we see only differences. But in one way we are all alike. Our governments have constantly betrayed us, turned their backs on us, used us until we could be used no more, and then cast us aside. The problem with institutions is, once they become so big, so many people have vested interests in their functioning and in the status quo that it is impossible to effect change for the better. Unfortunately, the world does continue to turn. Ages come and go, and so do nations. But we humans will remain. And yet, have we done this all before? In the roughly 2,000 years of what historians call modern history, we have seen empires rise and fall. In the so-called 8,000 years of recorded history we have for humanity, when they claim the first cultures began, we have seen cultures rise and fall. The important thing to think about when recalling what is known today as recorded history, the short span that it is that most history books that teach you that's how long humanity has been civilized tend to leave out each of those civilizations, have their own stories of prior civilizations. Now, archaeologists and historians mostly call this fancy and fantasy, but evidence has been found, links to the past. And if you would disregard the words of people like Plato on things like this, and yet speak so highly of his narratives on other topics, you're a fool to pick and choose. In previous years, more and more mainstream archaeologists and historians are coming forward with facts, things that defy the current narrative, and explain things that have so far been hidden away in dark corners because there was no explanation for them. This is promising, very nice to see, but worrisome. I worry there is no way, with all the things that have been hidden and destroyed, that we will ever reclaim our true history as the human race. At least not before we destroy each other for the color of our skins or our religious beliefs. And on the subject of God, let's discuss. There are many religions that have only one God. Two of the most predominant being Christianity and Judaism. Both of these follow what is called the Ten Commandments. One of those commandments is that thou shalt have no other God before me, implying from God's mouth that other gods existed but he was the most powerful. I pose to you, this is just another manipulation of power. A way to keep people subjugated and separate from other people. A reason to breed conflict down the road. Truly, what greatness has following any god brought anyone? As far as I know, no living god has spoken to a man in over 1,000 years. The other major monotheistic religion, meaning one god, Islam, it's not what most people think. I encourage you to do your own research on the subject, but the fact of the matter is, all of these religions are essentially the same. Not just in their tenets, but in their histories, their stories, their myths, their legends. I personally don't believe myths are myths. I believe each one is seated in some truth somewhere. I will have a whole lecture on this later, and we can discuss a bunch of them individually, but for now, suffice it to say, when you have cultures across the globe, before they even knew it was a globe, when they were unable to communicate with each other, telling the same stories with slightly different names, but almost identical details, orally, to keep the tradition alive for thousands of years. How can you say that these stories aren't true? They must all be based on the same event. Language evolves, people change. But these stories have remained with us since before the history we have records of. They probably would be in the records we don't have, going far further back. But as I've explained, governments who take control of other governments, other territories, other lands, other people, take control of the history. They destroy what they don't like or agree with, and they rewrite whatever they want. We're at a momentous time now, where history is being written by the moment. Most of us won't even be a part of it. But the fact of the matter remains, it will affect all of us. We all need to think about that before we make any sudden movements. You wouldn't be surprised what could happen when you back somebody into a corner. I know a lot of us feel that way now. Circling back to mythology and legend, as I said, I do not believe that these are just stories. I believe when the stories were originally told, there were people giving the most accurate description of events they had witnessed as possible at the time. Without sufficient vocabulary to describe technology that they didn't understand, they did the best that they could with the words that were at their disposal. As it has aged, it has not become any easier to understand, as even though we can translate the words, we can't translate things like euphemism or metaphor, or even simile most of the time. Without the context of the way the language was used at the time, there really is no telling what somebody said. Makes it difficult to understand. Like in the book of Ezekiel, speaking of wheels within wheels. It sounds like technology. It Sounds like he was having a hard time explaining what he saw. But what of Jacob's ladder? A ladder that climbed to the sky? Somebody saw something. Yet we simply dismiss these stories. I think it should not be so. I think they should be examined alongside our history. I think the context should be found to help us to understand where we truly came from as a people. Because according to most of these stories, we were put here. We didn't crawl up out of the mud. True, maybe our forebears did. But there are several cultures around the world who tell stories of an intercession by extraterrestrials. Interference in the gene pool, changing and adapting us to suit their needs. Among these cultures are the Middle Eastern cultures that speak of the Anunnaki. This is another topic I will be discussing in detail later, but for now, we're discussing myths. When I speak of myths, this applies more closely to the tales they have of their gods Enki and Enlil, and the myths of Egyptian gods, and the myths of Indian gods, and the myths of the Norse gods, and the gods of South America, and the North American natives. All of them have such similarities that the truth can't be denied. There must have, at one point, been a group of people, or groups of people, that were superior in nature, not only technologically, but in intelligence as well. And lastly, while we're on the subject of crazy conspiracy theories, let's talk about those hollow cavities I mentioned in the earth. Now, this is going to get really weird, and I want you to know that I'm not saying I necessarily believe this is true. Just believe it to be a possibility. Over the ages, there have been several mentionings of great serpents, or snake people. Now, I don't believe that if there was or is such a thing, that these creatures are extraterrestrial. Or I should elaborate and say, are extraterrestrial anymore. Certain cultures that talk about these beings talk about them being cast out for some reason and forced to go live inside the earth. Now, don't let me lose you here. Several of these cultures also speak of cities within the ground, deep under the earth, that flourish and are full of people with strange characteristics. Now, not all of these places are exactly the same, and the characteristics do tend to vary, which I suppose you could say lends to the idea that none of this is true. Or you could say it lends to the idea that there's more than one of these such areas. I'll let you make your own opinion on this one. But I bring it up because even the Native Americans of North America have stories of a time they spent living underground with the snake people. In South America, they have stories of the great snake gods. In the Middle East, the Sumerians had stories of the Anunnaki, who, when they show sculptures of them, are depicted with scales. In the Bible, the serpent spoke to Eve. What makes more sense? That a regular old snake was talking, or that at some point there was some form of a scaled life form on this planet. Begs a lot of questions. The main reason I'm willing to believe that there may or may not be a cavity inside of the Earth is not because of stories of cities like Agartha and the like. It's because nobody's allowed to fly over either of the poles. I find that odd, seeing as how we will circumnavigate the globe instead of flying over the top, which would result in a much shorter flight. Since I refuse to give credibility, any at all, to the flat earth theory, this leaves me to wonder what they're hiding. The truth of the matter is, some of the first people to visit the poles, especially flying over, did claim that there were openings. We'll discuss things like this in another video as well. For now, I'm sure you're thinking I'm a lunatic for talking about snake people. As I said, I don't necessarily believe that these are facts, but I do believe the stories have some basis in fact. They may be an exaggeration, they may just be stories. But when cultures all around the world are telling the same story, again, can they really just be stories? And so, to draw this to a conclusion, you now have a better idea of what we will be discussing and the types of videos you will find here on the channel. This is to be the end of this first lecture, an overview on future lectures, each of which will be on a single topic, but because of the all-encompassing nature of such things, may touch on some of these or other topics as well. Stay tuned for future videos. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. And if you could, tell a friend. Help them expand their mind as well.